a barefoot boy with frost on his heels slipped through the iron gates of a clifftop estate and found a little girl sitting in silence, so deep. Even the snow outside seemed afraid to fall near her. Her face was hollow. Her eyes were empty. Then he did something no one expected. He began to dance, not for money, not for warmth, but simply to make her smile. What happened next would shatter everything Edward Harrington thought he knew about wealth, healing, and love. Edward Harrington was one of the most powerful men in Canada. His empire stretched across oil, real estate, and technology from Vancouver to Toronto, earning him a reputation as cold and precise as the Pacific winters that rolled off the coast. Because everything Edward touched turned to profit. Every deal, every investment, every decision. But behind the towering iron gates of his West Vancouver estate, behind the marble floors and the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sea, his greatest failure was not a business. It was a silence. The silence of his only daughter, Eleanor, a little girl who had once filled every room in that vast house with laughter, and now filled none of them at all. Edward Harrington did not build his empire by feeling things. He built it by deciding them. By the time he was 42, his name sat at the top of 3 of Canada's largest energy companies, 2 real estate portfolios stretching from Vancouver Island to Bay Street, and a technology firm whose contracts ran quietly through half the country's infrastructure. Men twice his age returned his calls on the first ring. Boardrooms went still when he walked in. The world had decided long ago that Edward Harrington was untouchable. But the world had never seen him at 7 in the morning, standing outside his daughter's bedroom door, hand raised to knock, and unable to move. Eleanor was 8 years old and had not laughed in 11 months. The accident happened on a Tuesday in November. A rain-slick stretch of the sea-to-sky highway, a delivery truck that crossed the center line, and 3 seconds that took Evelyn from them and left Eleanor's spine damaged and her spirit somewhere none of Edward's money could reach. He had tried. God knew he had tried. A specialist in Toronto who spoke of nerve regeneration with careful optimism. A clinic in Zurich that charged what small countries earned in a year. A rehabilitation center outside Boston where Eleanor sat through 6 weeks of therapy in perfect, cooperative, devastating silence, improving nothing, feeling nothing, asking to go home in a voice so flat it frightened the staff. Edward brought her home to the estate on the cliff above the Pacific. He hired nurses, physiotherapists, a child psychologist who visited every Thursday. He stood at his office window in the evenings and watched the gray water below and understood, for the first time in his life, that there existed a problem his wealth was completely powerless to solve. His daughter was disappearing, and he could not buy her back. Nobody knew exactly how old Finn was. He guessed 10, maybe 11, based on nothing more reliable than the fact that winters seemed slightly less brutal than they had the year before. There was no birth certificate, no school record, no relative who had ever come looking. There was only Finn, small, quick-eyed, and very much alive in a city that had done its best to ignore him. He had been sleeping under the Granville Bridge since September, tucked into a corner where the concrete blocked the worst of the wind off the water. Before that, a doorway on Hastings. Before that, a story he didn't tell. He owned a jacket 2 sizes too large, a pair of canvas shoes held together at the toe with electrical tape, and nothing else worth naming. Most mornings he woke with fingers so stiff he had to breathe on them before they would bend. And then he danced. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because it earned him much. A few coins thrown from a passing stranger on Robson Street. A warm smile from a woman outside the coffee shop on Granville, who sometimes left him a paper cup without being asked. He danced because the moment his feet started moving, the cold retreated. The hunger grew quieter. The vast, indifferent machinery of the city, the cars, the glass towers, the people who looked through him, all of it fell back, just far enough that he could breathe. Dancing was the one thing Vancouver had never managed to take from him. He was not a sad boy. That was the thing people never understood when they looked at him. The bare feet, the too big jacket, the bright and restless eyes scanning everything at once. Finn was not broken. He was simply, stubbornly, unreasonably alive. He found the estate by accident. Finn had taken a wrong turn off Marine Drive, chasing the smell of something warm from a bakery vent, and ended up on a quiet road that curved along the cliff's edge where the houses grew larger and further apart until they stopped being houses at all and became something else entirely. He slowed when he reached the iron gates. They were twice his height, black and cold, with stone pillars on either side thick enough to hide behind. Beyond them, a long gravel path cut through a garden dusted white, leading to a house so large it seemed to generate its own silence. He almost kept walking. Then he saw her. She was sitting in a wheelchair just inside the ground floor window. A girl about his age, small and still, her cheek resting against the cold glass. She wasn't looking at anything. Not the garden, not the sky, not the iron gates where a barefoot boy stood watching her. She was simply there, the way furniture is simply there, present but absent, existing without inhabiting. Finn had seen that look before. He had worn it himself, once, in a doorway on a night cold enough to make thinking painful. It was the look of someone who had stopped expecting anything good to happen. He slipped through the gap in the hedgerow before he had fully decided to. The garden stones were icy under his bare feet. He didn't care. He planted himself 12 feet from her window, drew a breath, and began to dance. There was no music. There was no plan. His arms went wide and ridiculous. His feet slipped on the frost. His whole body moved in the most unhinged, chaotic, gloriously stupid way he could manage. The girl's eyes focused. A sound escaped her, small, involuntary, almost frightened by itself. A giggle. Then Edward Harrington laughed. Really laughed, loud and helpless and completely unrestrained. The sound bursting through the glass and rolling across the white garden and rising toward the balcony above, where Edward Harrington stood frozen, one hand on the railing, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to remember the last time he had heard anything so much like hope. His first thought was security. Edward's hand moved to his phone before the laughter had fully registered. A reflex, clean and automatic. The same instinct that had built his empire one controlled decision at a time. There was an unknown child in his garden, barefoot, unsupervised. He had not been let through the gate because no one had let him through anything, which meant the perimeter had a weakness, and weaknesses were corrected immediately. He was already dialing. Then he looked at Eleanor. She was upright, not the careful, managed posture the physiotherapist coaxed out of her during Thursday sessions. Not the hollow straightness of a girl enduring something. She was upright the way children are upright when they forget they have a body at all, leaning forward, both hands raised and clapping, color blazing in her cheeks, her eyes fixed on the boy below with an expression Edward had spent 11 months trying to locate and failing. She was present, completely, entirely, noisily present. He lowered the phone. The boy below was doing something that could only generously be called dancing. One foot sliding out from under him on the frost, arms pinwheeling to recover, spinning sideways in a way that seemed to be equal parts intentional and disaster. Eleanor shrieked with delight. The sound hit Edward somewhere beneath the ribcage, in a place he had kept very carefully closed since the sea-to-sky highway, and the rain, and the phone call that had ended one version of his life entirely. He stepped back behind the stone pillar. He did not call security. He did not move. He stood with one hand flat against the cold stone and watched his daughter laugh until her shoulders shook, his jaw tight, and his eyes burning with something he had nearly forgotten the name of. Hope. It felt, he thought, almost unbearable. Finn came back the next afternoon. He told himself he was just passing through. Same wrong turn, same cliff road, same coincidence. But he had spent the night under the Granville Bridge thinking about the sound of that girl's laughter, and his feet had simply gone where his mind already was. He slipped through the hedgerow gap at 3:30 and was 3 steps onto the garden stone before he saw the man. Edward Harrington was standing on the path with his hands in his coat pockets, very still, watching him. He was tall in the way that had nothing to do with height, the kind of stillness that filled the space entirely, that made the garden feel smaller and the iron gates feel further away. Finn's whole body tensed. He calculated the distance back to the hedge. He had run from worse. He didn't run. The silence lasted long enough to mean something. Then Eleanor's voice came through the ground floor window, thin, urgent, and real in a way it hadn't been in almost a year. "Please, Dad, don't send him away." Edward's eyes moved to the window, then back to the boy in front of him. He looked at him the way he looked at everything, completely, without hurry, missing nothing. The jacket too large for his frame. The bare feet reddened to the color of the cold stone beneath them. The eyes that looked straight back, without flinching. "Why did you come in here?" Edward asked. Finn swallowed once. She looked like she needed to laugh. "I didn't come to take anything, sir. I only came to give something small." The garden was very quiet. Edward exhaled, a long, slow breath that clouded briefly in the cold air and disappeared. "For a clock," he said. "Not a minute before. You eat before you leave." Finn's face broke into a grin, so sudden and unguarded it seemed to surprise even him. Behind the window, Eleanor clapped both hands together twice, sharp, delighted, certain. And just like that, the garden had a standing appointment. The 4 o'clock slot became the fixed point around which the rest of the day organized itself. Finn arrived without fail, through the hedgerow gap, until Edward quietly instructed the groundskeeper to leave the side gate unlatched at 3:45. He came with new material every afternoon, as though he spent his mornings under the bridge curating a performance. A slow-motion impression of a Robson Street busker that had Eleanor covering her mouth with both hands. A robot dance so stiff and mechanical that she demanded it 3 times in a row. A dramatic recreation of a seagull stealing a tourist sandwich near Canada Place that dissolved them both into helpless, breathless laughter until Eleanor had to beg him to stop. But it was not just laughter. Something else was happening, quieter and more significant, in the spaces between the performances. Eleanor's hands were stronger. The clapping that had begun as reflex was now purposeful, rhythmic, sustained. She began lifting her arms above her shoulders to copy Finn's wider movements, something she had refused to attempt in physiotherapy for months. She started spinning her wheelchair in small, tight circles when Finn spun on the frost-dusted stone, racing him, laughing at herself when she lost. Her specialist noticed during the monthly assessment. He reviewed his notes twice, then set them down and looked across the desk at Edward with an expression that sat somewhere between professional composure and undisguised astonishment. "The neurological engagement," he said carefully, "is remarkable. Whatever is happening at home, whatever changed, do not stop it." That evening, after Finn had eaten and gone and the garden had settled back into its cold quiet, Edward stood alone on the stone path with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the space where the boy had been. "Thank you, boy," he said softly to no one. The Pacific wind moved through the hedgerow and said nothing back. But the garden, Edward thought, felt fractionally warmer than it had before. It happened on a Tuesday, which seemed too ordinary a day for a miracle. The sky was flat and white, the garden dusted with a thin new layer of overnight snow, and Finn was mid-performance, his slow-motion snow shuffle, a routine in which he moved across the garden stones with the exaggerated gravity of a man walking on the moon, each foot lifting and descending with enormous, absurd ceremony. Eleanor was laughing so hard the blanket slipped from her lap unnoticed, her whole body shaking, one hand pressed to her stomach. Then she went still, not the old stillness, not the hollow, absent quiet of the girl who had stared through the window for 11 months. This was different. This was concentration. "I want to try standing," she said. Finn stopped mid-shuffle. Edward, who had been watching from the garden bench with his coat collar turned up against the cold, went completely rigid. Eleanor placed both hands on her armrests. Her arms shook immediately, fine, visible tremors running from her wrists to her shoulders. Her jaw set in a way that reminded Edward, with a force that nearly undid him, of Evelyn. She pushed. Nothing happened. Then something did. Her hips rose, an inch, then 2. Her legs, which the specialists in 3 countries had spoken about in the careful language of uncertainty, began slowly, impossibly, to straighten. Finn whispered, "1." Edward stood up from the bench, without realizing he had done it. 2. Eleanor's entire body trembled. Her face was fierce and wet and incandescent. 3. She held it. 3 full seconds, upright and shaking and entirely herself, before she sank back into the chair, laughing and weeping at the same time, both hands pressed to her face. "Did you see me, Dad?" Her voice broke clean in half. I stood. Edward crossed the garden in 4 steps and dropped to his knees beside her. He took her trembling hands in his. His own were shaking worse. He opened his mouth and found, for the first time in his adult life, that there were no words inside him adequate to the moment. So he said nothing. He simply held on. He found Finn on the rear steps long after the house had gone quiet. The boy was sitting with his knees pulled to his chest, canvas shoes set neatly beside him, bare feet on the cold stone. He was looking out at the Pacific, dark and vast and indifferent below the cliff's edge, the kind of view that made a person feel either very significant or very small. From the set of Finn's shoulders, Edward could see which one it was doing to him tonight. He had been inside too long. He had eaten at the kitchen table, laughed with Eleanor while the housekeeper cleared the plates, and then simply drifted. The way children drift when they do not know if they are guests or something else, and are afraid to ask. He had found the rear steps and sat down on them the way he sat on doorways and bridge abutments and every other place that was not quite his, carefully, taking up as little space as possible. Edward opened the back door and stepped out without turning on the light. He lowered himself onto the step beside Finn and said nothing for a moment. The water moved far below them. The cold came up through the stone. Then he spoke. "You're not going back out there." Finn turned his head slowly, uncertain he had heard correctly. "This is your home now," Edward said. "You are part of this family." He looked at the boy directly, the way he looked at everything that mattered, without evasion, without qualifier. "Anyone who gives hope is not just worth knowing, Finn. They are worth loving." The boy's face did something complicated and irreversible. His eyes filled and then spilled over, and he made no move to hide it, because this was not the cold crying, not the hunger crying, not the invisible crying he had done alone under the bridge on the worst nights. This was something else entirely, something he had no previous experience of. This was belonging. That night, Finn slept in a bed with a proper mattress and a wool blanket pulled to his chin, in a room with a window that looked out over the Pacific. The wind came off the water as it always had, but it stayed outside where it belonged. The story broke on a Thursday morning. By noon, it was on the front page of the Vancouver Sun, picked up by the National Wire Services by 2 o'clock, and trending across every platform by the time Edward sat down for dinner. Harrington opens estate to street orphan. The headline was restrained compared to what followed: the opinion columns, the radio commentary, the carefully worded messages from board members who used words like optics and liability and due diligence while meaning something far less polite. His oldest business partner called twice. His lawyer called 3 times. At a charity function that weekend, a woman whose family had known the Harringtons for 2 generations touched his arm with a look of exquisite concern and said she hoped he was getting enough sleep. Edward thanked her and moved on. When the board raised it formally, he let them finish. Then he said, quietly and without heat, "My daughter is standing again. My daughter is laughing again. That is the only reputation I care about." He did not say it again because he did not need to. He picked up his papers and left the room, and the conversation ended there. Eleanor was walking by February, not far and not without effort, Finn's hand in hers, both of them moving slowly along the garden path while their breath clouded in the cold air. Eleanor concentrating fiercely on each step and Finn narrating her progress in the voice of a sports commentator until she laughed too hard to continue. She still used the wheelchair on difficult days, but the fear that had lived inside it with her was gone. Finn danced every afternoon without being asked. He requested nothing, accumulated nothing, and seemed to require only what he had always required: movement, laughter, and the particular freedom of being exactly where he was supposed to be. One afternoon in early March, Eleanor reached over and pulled him close without warning, her chin on his shoulder, and whispered something Edward, standing just inside the doorway, was not meant to hear. "I used to be alone in this house," she said. "Now I have a brother." Edward said nothing. He stepped back from the doorway and stood for a moment in the corridor with his hand flat against the wall, looking at nothing in particular. He did not need to say anything. The cold estate his wealth had built and his grief had emptied was gone, replaced by something that could not be purchased, could not be managed, and had arrived, as the best things do, through a gap in the hedge on a Tuesday afternoon, barefoot and ridiculous and absolutely certain that a girl behind a frosted window needed to laugh. The greatest thing Edward Harrington had ever owned, it turned out, was not the oil fields or the buildings or the view from the cliff above the Pacific. It was this, exactly this, the sound of two children laughing in a winter garden, and the knowledge that he had been wise enough, just barely, to let in